The Iron Blood Pack celebration did not begin when the doors opened. It began the moment he walked through them. Vera felt it before she saw it, the shift in the room's breathing, the way 200 bodies collectively forgot what they were doing and turned toward the entrance like a tide answering a moon it had no choice but to follow. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter softened into something more careful. Even the candles seemed to lean toward him, as if the light itself had decided to pay attention. She had been standing at the edge of the room for 40 minutes with a cup she had not tasted once, her eyes on the dark tree line beyond the far window, her back deliberately, precisely turned toward the entrance. She had been succeeding at being exactly where she intended to be, invisible, unremarkable, safe. And then the room changed its breathing, and she knew without turning that he had arrived. She gave herself exactly 3 seconds, no more. 3 was the number she had decided on before she came, the maximum she could justify without it becoming something other than professional assessment. Then, with the steady precision of a woman checking conditions before walking into something she already knew was dangerous, she looked. One glance, unhurried. The focused attention of someone who had been studying this particular subject from a careful distance for long enough to know exactly what she was looking at. Calum Drax stood at the entrance the way catastrophes stand, not with aggression, simply with inevitability. Tall, terrifyingly still. The kind of stillness that did not come from restraint, but from the absolute confidence of a man who had never once entered a space that did not immediately arrange itself around him. Gold eyes moving across the room with the patience of something that already knew it would find what it was looking for. She had studied those eyes for 2 years. She knew their cadence, how they moved across a room, how they found a target, how they held it with a particular quality of attention that felt like being the only person in the world right up until the moment it shifted elsewhere. She knew what the shifting looked like, too. She had documented it. She had spoken with women who had been on the receiving end of it and watched carefully what the losing of it did to them over time. The eyes were not cruel. That was the important thing to understand about Calum Drax. His eyes were never cruel. Cruelty implied awareness of another person's experience. What his eyes were was something that looked identical to genuine, singular interest until the precise moment it revealed itself as something far more ordinary and far more costly to the person who had believed in it. She had seen this documented in 16 separate cases. She looked away first. She was the only woman in the room who did. She felt it. The specific sensation of being the only person moving against a current that everyone else had surrendered to without questioning. She held her cup steady. She kept her breathing even and deliberate. She told herself it meant nothing, which was something she had been telling herself at increasing frequency over the past 4 days, and with decreasing conviction each time. Then the room shifted again, differently this time. The earlier shift had been collective, 200 people responding to the entrance of power. This shift had direction. A crowd parting not randomly, but specifically, the way crowds parted when something with purpose was moving through them toward a fixed point. Her pulse spiked once, sharp, entirely involuntary, honest in a way she found deeply inconvenient, given the effort she had invested in being the opposite of honest with herself about this particular situation. He does not get to know. She locked it in like a bolt driven home, that she already knows exactly who he is. She arranged her face into something warm and pleasantly unremarkable, the expression of a woman who was present at a gathering and finding it agreeable and nothing more. She had practiced this expression. Not in front of a mirror, though she had done that too in the earlier years. She had practiced it in difficult rooms, council meetings, territorial gatherings, any occasion that required her to appear smaller than she was and less aware than she was, which, in her experience, was most occasions involving people with more power than her. She did not turn until he was directly beside her. Turning too early signaled anticipation. Turning too late signaled performance. She turned at exactly the right moment, the moment when turning was the only natural option remaining, and she met his scent before she met his eyes. Pine, iron, something older underneath both of those things that moved through her before she could step in and redirect it. Something her body recognized before her mind had any say in the matter. She looked at him the way you look at a stranger at a gathering you are only partially attending. She gave him the full attention of her eyes and the complete absence of any recognition behind them, and she watched something happen in his face that she had not seen documented anywhere in 2 years of careful observation. Not the smooth performance of a man who expected this reception and had prepared for it. Not the easy adjustment of someone accustomed to managing mild friction with the confidence of lifelong practice. Something more unguarded than either. A fractional pause, a quality of attention sharpening in a way that was not about dominance, but about something less familiar to him. Genuine uncertainty. He extended his hand. She looked at it for exactly 1 beat, long enough to be natural, short enough to give him nothing and cost him nothing, and then she looked back up with a warm and completely sealed smile. "I'm sorry," she said, with the ease of a woman who had rehearsed these exact words in the private space of her own mind until they had no edges remaining, no tells, no tremor of the awareness underneath them. "I didn't quite catch your name." The silence that followed lasted approximately 2 seconds. She counted them. In those 2 seconds, she watched something moved through the expression of the Alpha King of the Obsidian Throne that she had not once encountered in 2 years of studying him from the safety of distance. It was not the entitled response of a man meeting minor resistance in his own territory. It was not the smooth recalibration of a king managing a small social irregularity. It was sharper than either, closer to genuine focus, the specific quality of attention that arrived not when something bored him, but when something had just revealed itself as worth significantly more consideration than the situation had initially appeared to require. He smiled, slow, deliberate in the way of a man who had just been handed something unexpected and was deciding in real time that he found it worth his full attention. He told her his name, and Vera's pulse, which she had been managing with the focused discipline of someone who understood that the body's responses were data to be noted rather than performances to be indulged, did not slow down the way a well-prepared pulse was supposed to slow down when a prepared test was passed. It accelerated, with the specific urgency of something that had been waiting for this exact moment, without informing her of its intentions, like it had known something she had spent 2 years ensuring she would never find out. It did not merely betray her, it betrayed her completely, immediately, and without any gesture toward apology. And beneath the betrayal, beneath the alarm that followed it, something that felt, in the worst possible way, like recognition, like her own body arriving somewhere it already knew. She had not always known how to read dangerous men. That was a skill you built or you paid for, and Vera had paid the first installment before she understood what she was purchasing. She grew up in the Ashford order pack, small territory, modest bloodlines, the kind of place that powerful people flew over on their way to somewhere with more political weight.
There was a particular kind of freedom available in that kind of place if you understood how to use it correctly. The freedom of not being worth anyone's sustained attention. She had understood that early, in the direct way that children understood things adults had stopped seeing, without the softening layer of experience that made most adults call indifference something more bearable than it was. She had understood that being overlooked was not a wound. Properly managed, it was a resource. Smallness was armor if you wore it with intention rather than shame. She had been wearing it with intention since she was old enough to know the difference.
She learned to read storms young, not weather, men. The distinction was practical rather than philosophical. Weather you could not influence. Men you could navigate if you paid the right kind of attention early enough and did not make the mistake of believing that their attention toward you constituted care for you. She watched her pack's second-in-command take a mate from a highborn family and treat her the way people treated things they had worked hard to obtain, with initial pride that curdled slowly into indifference as ownership replaced the energy of pursuit. She watched the woman shrink. Not dramatically, the way things shrank under sustained cold, gradually, beginning at the edges, then moving inward until the version of herself that had existed before the match was so reduced that no one who hadn't known her before could accurately identify what had been lost or how much of it there had been. She watched her childhood friend Senna leave for the Greywood territory on the arm of an alpha who looked at her the way certain people looked at rare things, with an appetite that had not yet been required to define itself as care or possession or anything more specific than want. Senna came back 2 seasons later. She was not visibly changed in any of the ways Vera had been prepared to recognize. She laughed at the same things, she sat in the same chairs, she wore the same colors. But her laugh stopped a half-second too early now, like something inside her had learned to check the room before it allowed joy to complete itself. Like completed joy was something that could be used against you if you weren't careful about where and when you let it be visible. Senna did not come back again after that visit. No formal explanation, just the gradual absence that functioned as its own kind of answer. That was the real education, not the warnings other women offered in careful, lowered voices when they thought no one with authority was listening, not the patterns Vera would later document with the organized precision of someone building a careful case over a long period of time. The actual education was Senna's laugh with its missing half-second, the precise, specific, irreplaceable sound of what happened to a person when someone they had trusted was careless with them long enough and consistently enough that they stopped expecting anything different and began building their life around the expectation of nothing different. Vera carried that sound into every room she entered afterward. She carried it the way you carried the knowledge of a particular road's dangers. Not with fear exactly, but with the permanent adjustment in approach that fear, once fully processed, eventually became. She did not explain the notes she started keeping. She simply began paying the kind of attention that most people reserved for things they were already afraid of. She documented the pattern the way a careful person documented anything capable of consistent harm, methodically, without emotional editorializing, with the understanding that the value of documentation was in its precision, and that precision required setting aside the feelings the subject generated in order to see it clearly and accurately. Powerful men who confused proximity with ownership, men who mistook their own sustained interest for a form of care when what it actually was the pleasure of pursuit, a pleasure with a natural end point, a point at which pursuit became possession, and possession became familiar, and familiar became invisible. Men who moved through the lives of the people around them the way seasons moved through a landscape, thoroughly, inevitably, without malice, and without any sustained awareness of what the passage cost the landscape being moved through. She had catalogued 16 of them by 22.
Calum Drax was not the worst by conventional measure. He was the most structurally complete example of the pattern she had encountered. Not the most damaging in isolation. That distinction required care. There were men on her list who had acted with deliberate awareness of the harm they were causing and had used that awareness as a tool. Calum Drax was not that. What he was required more careful documentation, precisely because it was harder to name and therefore harder to prepare a defense against. He was simply indifferent. Comprehensively, historically, structurally indifferent, not as a choice, but as a condition, the way a building with no insulation was not choosing to be cold. 11 years on the Obsidian Throne, 11 years of a world that rearranged itself before he could register want, and women who adjusted themselves to whatever season required, and not once, in any account she had found in 2 years of careful searching, a single documented instance of him looking back at what he left. That was the specific thing, the not looking back. That was what she had built her entire preparation around. It was what separated his particular pattern of damage from the men who acted with awareness and therefore, in some ways, with accountability. You could hold a man accountable for what he knew he was doing. You could not hold a man accountable for what his entire life had been arranged to protect him from ever needing to understand. That was not a defense of him, it was a description of him. And the description mattered because it told you precisely what you were dealing with. Not a man who would hurt you and feel something about it. A man who would move through you and feel nothing. Not because he was empty, but because his entire existence had been constructed in such a way that no one had ever required him to register the weight of his own passage through other people's lives. This was what she had told herself. This was what she knew. This was what she believed, completely and accurately, right up until the moment in the garden. She had not volunteered for the Iron Blood celebration. That required stating clearly, because the alternative implied a choice she had not made. Her pack leader had sent her as an obligation, one body to fill the female attendance quota the Iron Blood territory required of affiliated packs during the king's gathering seasons. A formality, a number on a list. She had arrived with one intention fully formed and locked: be warm, be present, be sufficiently unremarkable that no one with authority would find her worth the sustained attention that led to being selected for anything. She was skilled at this. She had been practicing versions of it since she was old enough to understand that being noticed by the wrong person at the wrong moment was one of the fastest ways available to lose something you had spent significant effort building. She had the Ashford wildflowers on her windowsill at home as a reminder of what came from being noticed, or rather, what came after. She had been succeeding at the celebration for 4 days. She had occupied the middle distance of every gathering, present enough to fulfill the obligation, unremarkable enough to be functionally invisible to people whose attention carried consequences. She had spoken to minor officials from outlying territories and asked them careful questions about trade corridors and water rights, and had been in every measurable way exactly the kind of person no one with ambition looked at twice. She had felt Calum Drax's attention pass over her twice in the first 2 days, those gold eyes conducting their patient inventory of the room. And both times it had moved on without pausing, which was exactly what she had arranged for it to do. She had been, she told herself on the morning of the 5th day, in complete control of the situation. And then she made the specific and irreversible mistake of standing at the edge of the room at the wrong moment on the 5th evening. He extended his hand. She looked at it with the composure of a woman who had been preparing for this exact moment, and said with perfect warm neutrality that she hadn't quite caught his name. The Alpha King said his name. She watched something happen in his face that 2 years of careful long-distance observation had not prepared her for. Not entitlement meeting minor friction, not the smooth adjustment of a man managing a small irregularity in his own territory. Something more unguarded, a sharpening, the quality of attention arriving not when something was predictable and manageable, but when something had just revealed itself as worth significantly more consideration than expected. He smiled, slow. And it was that smile, not the gold eyes, not the authority pressing against the air around him. It was that particular, unhurried, privately calibrated smile that was her first genuine indication that she had made an error somewhere in her preparations. An error she could not immediately locate, which was the most concerning kind. He had never learned to want things he couldn't have. That was not arrogance stated for effect. It was the accurate description of a life in which desire and acquisition had never once been separated by the inconvenience of distance. Calum Drax had been born into a world that rearranged itself before he could register a want fully enough to name it. The meal appeared. The territory yielded. The room quieted. Women arrived at the edge of his attention and stayed at whatever proximity the season required and moved on when the season changed. And the movement had always been so smooth and so inevitable that it had never once required him to look at it directly and name what it was. He had grown up understanding, in the way you understood a language learned before you were old enough to know you were learning it, that wanting something was simply the first half of already having it. No distance required, no effort required, no accountability required. His father had called this power. His father had called most things power, the ability to take without asking, to hold without explaining, to release without accounting for what the release cost the thing being let go. He had demonstrated this particularly clearly in his management of the women in the territory who had made the mistake of being visible to him long enough to register as significant. His father had not been deliberately harmful to these women in the way that required conscious decision-making. That was the thing that had taken Calum longest to begin examining, and the examination had only recently begun, which was itself information about his own blind spots that he was still in the early stages of processing honestly. His father had simply been indifferent, in the total, structural way of a man who had never once been required to consider that the people around him had interior lives that continued after his attention moved elsewhere. He had inherited this completely. He had inherited it the way you inherited a language, completely, unconsciously, without being presented with evidence that other languages existed, or that the one you spoke had limitations the speaker couldn't perceive from inside it. The women were the clearest evidence of the inheritance operating without examination. They came. They were present for whatever season required their presence. They were set aside when the season changed. Not with announcement, not with ceremony, simply with the gradual withdrawal of attention that functioned as its own complete statement. He never looked back, not because he decided against it, because it had genuinely, structurally never occurred to him that looking back was something the situation required of him, that there might be something behind him worth turning around for, that the season he was moving away from had mattered to the person who had been living in it while he was there. This had been his operating reality for 34 years. It had never once been challenged. Until now. His wolf had been restless for 7 months. Not the clean, purposeful restlessness of a predator before a hunt. He knew that feeling well, had relied on it, could manage it with the practice ease of someone who had been doing exactly that for 11 years. This was different in a way he had not found adequate language for, despite significant time spent looking for it. A frequency in his blood pointing at nothing on any map he owned. A compass needle spinning toward a direction that did not correspond to any territory in his kingdom, any alliance on his council's agenda, any threat in his current intelligence reports. He had run the mountain ridges alone at midnight until his body was exhausted and returned no quieter than he left. He had sat through 3 consecutive council sessions of genuine political consequence and been so thoroughly absent from the present moment that Marin had taken to finding quiet ways to return him to the room without drawing the council's notice to his absence. Marin had served 3 kings. She was not a woman given to alarm. She had seen too much over too long a period to respond to most developments with anything other than the steady, cataloging attention of a very experienced professional who had learned that the first interpretation of most events was rarely the accurate one. She had watched Calum's father rule with the cold efficiency of a man who had long since stopped questioning his own judgment and started calling it certainty. She had watched Calum come to the throne at an age that should have been too young for it, and prove, with a consistency that had initially genuinely surprised her, that he was better suited for the position than his father had been in nearly every measurable way. She had spent 11 years learning his particular tells, the jaw, the quality of his stillness, the exact way his eyes moved when he was conducting 3 conversations simultaneously in his own mind, while appearing fully present. She did not have a name for what she was watching now. He entered the Iron Blood celebration as obligation. He had attended 12 of them. The room behaved as rooms always behaved around him. The collective reorientation, the drop in ambient sound, the specific charged quality of 200 people simultaneously remembering who was in the room with them. He had stopped noticing this around year 3 of his reign. It had become environmental rather than notable, the way the sound of a river became environmental once you had lived beside it long enough to stop hearing it as a distinct thing. His wolf registered none of the room's familiar arrangement. His wolf was doing something it had not done in 7 months of restless, directionless searching. It had gone still. Not with calm, with the absolute arrested attention of a creature that has encountered something in its environment that has changed in a way it does not yet have language for, but recognizes with complete certainty as significant. He followed his wolf's attention before he consciously formed the decision. That had never happened before either.
She was at the edge of the room with her back to him, and a cup she wasn't drinking from, and her entire body doing something that stopped him before he had fully processed what he was observing. Every other person in the room had oriented toward him. She was oriented toward the window. Not as performance, he had seen performed disinterest before, recognized it immediately, found it transparently calculated. This was different. This was private. The specific quality of a person maintaining their own direction in a space that had collectively surrendered its direction to someone else. As if the room's rearrangement had simply not reached her, as if she occupied a different field entirely, one that his presence had not altered and could not alter without her choosing to allow it. His wolf pressed forward against his ribs with a force that was not aggression and not what he would have called recognition and not anything he had a prepared category for. He crossed the room. He could not have identified when he made the decision to do so. She turned when he was beside her and looked at him with eyes that did something he had genuinely never experienced in 34 years of being looked at by people who wanted things from him.
They assessed him, not with the warm performance of availability, not with the carefully arranged softness that women constructed when they wanted to be selected, not with the professional consideration that council members and territorial leaders offered when they needed something from the crown and understood that appearing to need it was a liability to be managed. She looked at him the way a skilled professional looked at a subject of study, thoroughly, calmly, with the focused attention of someone gathering accurate information rather than transmitting any kind of availability. Like he was data, not a destination, not an opportunity. Data, something to be accurately understood. His wolf pressed forward again, harder, with an urgency he found genuinely alarming, given that he had no framework for what it was responding to so strongly. He said his name. She asked him to repeat it. The Alpha King of the Obsidian Throne, 11 years of a world that had never once asked him to repeat himself, said his name again to a woman in a border pack's attendance colors who received the information with the calm, focused attention of someone noting a useful fact rather than encountering something that required a visible response. Across the room, Marin went very still. In 20 years, she had catalogued every expression this man's face was capable of producing. She knew his face the way careful people knew dangerous geography, with the thorough, respectful attention of someone who understood fully what it was capable of. She had never seen it do what it was doing right now. He looked, she thought, watching him with the quiet focus of a woman filing something significant for later consideration. He looked like a man who had just discovered for the first time in his life that he was hungry for something, and that the thing he was hungry for had no idea he existed. He sent flowers on the second morning. Not flowers chosen for their visual appeal or their cost or their ability to speak the conventional language of romantic pursuit. Ashford wildflowers, the specific variety that grew along the eastern border ridge of her home territory, the ones that required someone to know exactly where she was from and to have cared enough to source them overnight from a distance that made the sourcing itself a statement about the level of attention being paid. They arrived at her guest quarters before she was fully awake, wrapped in plain brown paper without a note of any kind, which was, she understood immediately, more deliberate than a note would have been. A note had clear social grammar. It could be evaluated, responded to, managed within established conventions. The absence of a note offered nothing to respond to, and therefore required something from her that a note, with its available responses, would not have required. She put them in water. She went to breakfast. She did not acknowledge them in any observable way. She sat beside a trade official from the Western Corridor at breakfast and asked him careful questions about water rights disputes and seasonal grazing boundaries, and she was, by every measurable indicator, a woman who found her breakfast companion's work genuinely worth her attention, and the gathering around her pleasantly stimulating, and the Alpha King of the Obsidian Throne, who was seated close enough that she could feel the particular quality of his focused attention on the side of her face with the physical specificity of actual warmth, entirely unremarkable. She maintained this for 40 minutes. She was aware of his attention the entire time, with the focused, specific awareness of someone pretending not to feel a fire in a room while conducting a perfectly normal conversation about something else entirely. When she finally glanced in his direction, it was with the brief, pleasant acknowledgement of a woman who had just remembered someone was in her vicinity and found the remembering of no particular significance. This was the pattern for 3 days. He arranged proximity with the quiet precision of a man who had never in his life had to arrange anything and was discovering, apparently without significant distress, that arranging things when the usual mechanisms of his position were deliberately set aside required a different kind of effort than he had previously been required to develop. She would find herself positioned near him at evening gatherings, in receiving lines, at tables where she had specifically selected seats facing away from where he was likely to be placed. He never pressed, never performed, simply appeared with the steady and unhurried consistency of weather that had decided to follow someone indoors, regardless of their preferences about indoor weather. And every time she met it with warmth, with the pleasant, completely sealed composure of a woman who found him perfectly agreeable and entirely unmemorable. She could feel it affecting him, the not knowing, the absence of any readable signal, the way her consistent warmth with no content behind it was doing something to his composure that a direct refusal never could have managed.
She could feel his wolf, too. That was the part she had not fully accounted for in her preparations, because accounting for it would have required acknowledging a sensitivity she preferred not to examine too directly. She was not a full shifter. She carried enough of the bloodline to have instincts sharper than most people without the full range of abilities, but she had enough sensitivity to pack dynamics, to read the social geography of gatherings like this one in ways that went beyond ordinary observation. She could feel his wolf's restlessness the way you felt a change in pressure before a significant weather event. Not the event itself, but the air that preceded it, the specific heaviness that informed you something was building before you had any visible confirmation. His wolf was not aggressive. That was not the right word. What it was searching, like something that had been looking in the wrong direction for a very long time, and had just turned toward the right one, and was not yet certain what it was sensing. Then Dara Voss stepped out of the shadow near the eastern stairwell on the fourth evening, and said her name. Vera stopped walking. She knew who Dara was. High-born, from one of the 3 families whose value to the Obsidian Throne made their members permanent fixtures at these gatherings. Perhaps 28, the kind of composed that was not natural ease, but the specific, hard-earned steadiness of a person who had learned that revealing too much in the wrong room had costs that took a significant time to stop paying. She was not bitter. Vera registered that immediately, and it was the thing that produced the drop in her stomach she had not been expecting, because bitterness had edges you could assess and account for, a perspective with a clear origin point you could factor into your evaluation of its accuracy. This was something past bitterness, something that had processed through bitterness and come out the other side, into a quieter, more settled territory. This was just truth, standing in a corridor, asking for 5 minutes. Dara spoke without drama, without rehearsed cadence, with the even, unhurried specificity of someone giving a first-hand account, not because she wanted sympathy or validation, not because she wanted to cause harm, but because she was the only person in this building who possessed the specific knowledge she was carrying, and she had decided that leaving this gathering without passing it on would be a failure of a different kind than the one she was already managing. She told Vera about the season she had been present for in Calum Drax's life, the quality of his attention at the beginning of it, how it felt specifically and particularly to be the person receiving it, how complete it felt, how it carried none of the performative quality of men who were aware of pursuing and wanted that awareness acknowledged, how it felt, in the most accurate description she had available, like being genuinely seen by someone with the capacity to see clearly.
She told her about the end of it, too. Not with bitterness. She was past that stage, which was informative in its own way about the duration and depth of what she had processed. She told her about the specific morning she had understood, with the complete and permanent clarity that certain understandings arrived with and did not subsequently revise, that she had never once been the point, that what she had interpreted as singular attention had been the pleasure of pursuit, a thing with a natural endpoint determined entirely by the internal architecture of the man conducting the pursuit and having nothing to do with the person being pursued. "He doesn't look back," Dara said, not with bitterness, not with anger, with the specific, quiet exhaustion of a woman restating a physical law that the universe had required her to learn through direct personal experience rather than through the instruction that would have been considerably less costly. It is not a decision he makes, it is simply what he does. Vera listened to every word. She did not tell Dara she already knew most of it. She did not tell her that the knowing had recently, without her permission and without consulting the 2 years of careful documentation she had constructed specifically to prevent exactly this, stopped being the same as feeling. She said thank you, and she meant it with the full weight of a woman who understood precisely what it cost to stand in a corridor and deliver this kind of account to a stranger for no benefit to yourself. She watched Dara walk back toward the lit rooms of the celebration with the steady, unhurried gait of a woman who had just set something down she had been carrying for a long time and was still deciding how to feel about the absence of the weight. Then she went to her guest quarters and stood in the dark with her palms flat against the cool stone wall. She gave herself 30 seconds, exactly 30, counted in the dark. She felt it, all of it, the full, unedited weight of what she had been containing, with increasing effort since the moment he crossed the hall on the first night, the way her pulse had not returned to its resting rate once in 5 days. The way she had, without authorizing the activity, memorized the exact quality of his voice saying her name across a dinner table, despite giving every available external signal that she had not found it worth remembering. The way her body had been conducting a completely separate and unauthorized negotiation with her feelings for 5 days, without informing the part of her that kept careful documentation and made considered decisions based on available evidence. She felt all of it, without softening it or making it smaller or more manageable than it actually was. 30 seconds, not one more. She locked it back down with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before, and was aware that the practice was becoming less efficient each time she needed it. Her hands were still flat against the stone. She noticed, with the cold precision of a woman evaluating evidence against herself, that she wanted a 31st second, that she wanted 31 seconds more than she had wanted almost anything in recent memory, more than she wanted to be back in her border pack, more than she wanted to be unremarkable and overlooked and safe. She was still calculating the full implications of this data point when she detected it, at the far end of the corridor, faint enough that a person without her particular sensitivity would not have caught it. Pine. Iron, the specific and unmistakable combination she had first identified when he stood beside her, and that her nervous system had, without any authorization from her, been cataloging at every subsequent proximity since. He was at the end of the corridor. He had stopped. Like something had brought him here, like something had been confirmed, like he was, for the first time in 11 years of absolute certainty about everything, not entirely sure what came next.
She found the pup at first light, pressed against the eastern garden wall with the specific, quiet stillness of a creature that had made a private peace with not being found. Small, underfed, one back leg held at an angle that communicated its entire recent history without requiring any further detail. It had been overlooked by the celebration staff with the efficient thoroughness of people managing a large event who had unconsciously sorted every element of their environment into things requiring attention and things that did not. The pup had been sorted into the second category and had accepted this with the resigned accommodation of something that had quietly stopped expecting a different outcome. It was not trembling. Vera understood that particular stillness from the inside. Trembling meant you still believed the situation might change. This pup had moved past trembling into the quieter, more permanent place on the other side of it. She sat down on the cold ground beside it and placed dried meat just inside the edge of its awareness. Not close enough to force a response, close enough to make one possible. She did not hear him approach. One moment, the garden held only her and the pup, and the gray pre-dawn light, and the distant, barely audible sounds of the keep beginning its morning routines. The next, Calum Drax lowered himself to the ground on the other side of the pup with the quiet, economical movement of a man who had done this before, not for an audience, not as a performance of any kind, simply because the situation was one he knew how to respond to, and he was responding to it. No announcement, no explanation, no version of a statement about what this moment was intended to communicate. He sat, read the pup's posture with eyes that clearly understood what they were reading, produced dried meat from his jacket, better quality than hers, she noted with the distant precision of someone who catalogued things, even when cataloging served no immediately useful purpose, and placed it at the same careful distance she had chosen, with the same patient understanding of what the distance was for.
They sat in silence. The gray light shifted incrementally toward something that would become gold. The pup conducted its slow, methodical investigation, nose forward, weight carefully balanced over its 3 sound legs, the agonizing arithmetic of a frightened thing deciding whether the evidence in front of it was sufficient grounds for revising its current assumption about the world. Vera watched the pup. She was aware, with the acute and somewhat unwelcome specificity of someone trying to attend to one thing while another thing pressed steadily at the edges of her attention, that the man beside her was paying the same quality of patient, unhurried attention to the same small animal with no apparent agenda beyond the attention itself. No glances toward her to verify that his patience was being observed and credited, no performance of the waiting, just the waiting, existing in the garden in the early morning without any visible requirement that it be witnessed or acknowledged by anyone other than the pup it was intended for. The pup took the meat from his hand first, not hers, his. She watched it happen and felt something move through her chest that she did not have a prepared category for in any of her 2 years of careful documentation. Not the warm, manageable feeling she had been containing since the first night. Not the informed caution she had been using as a counterweight. Something that existed in the space between those 2 things and arrived quietly, without announcement, and settled the way a stone settled into still water, without asking permission, without explaining itself, with the complete indifference of something that simply belonged where it landed. She made the mistake, then, of looking at him directly, without the composure assembled, without the warm and pleasant distance she had been maintaining with the focused and constant effort of someone holding a significant weight against consistent pressure. She looked at his face in the gray light and found something that stopped her breath with its unexpectedness.
uncertainty. Raw, unperformed, unmanaged, the specific expression of a man who did not know if he was doing something correctly and had no available structure to consult for the answer. Not the controlled uncertainty of a strategic position being calibrated for maximum effect. The actual kind. The kind that arrived when something mattered, and you did not know if you were equal to it, and you could not manage your way around the not knowing, because the not knowing was precisely the point. He was not performing. He was simply present in a garden in the early morning with a frightened animal and an uncertainty he was not concealing, because concealing things required an audience, and he did not appear to believe he had one. It was the most significant thing she had witnessed in 5 days of careful observation. More significant than the gold eyes, more significant than the attention. More significant because it was not constructed. It had no architecture. It was simply real.
The pup climbed into the space between them and rested its chin on her knee and released a long, slow breath that sounded like days of held tension finally finding its exit. The three of them remained in the garden until the gray light went gold, and the gold light went warm, and the sounds of the keep shifted from the spare sounds of early morning to the fuller sounds of a building resuming its routines and its obligations. Vera understood, with the quiet and complete precision of absolute clarity arriving at an inconvenient moment, that her feelings had crossed a line she had been maintaining with great effort and at significant personal cost for a very long time. They were no longer something she managed, they were something she carried, permanently, without having been asked, without having decided. She did not tell him this. She told him almost nothing, but she let him stay until the light was fully warm. That was its own statement. She let it stand. On her way back inside, she passed Dara in the corridor. They did not speak. There was nothing to say that the silence between them did not already contain more accurately than words would have. Dara looked at her with an expression that had moved entirely past warning, past the steady, careful delivery of a first-hand account in a quiet corridor on the 4th evening. What was in her face now was recognition, the specific, personal recognition of a woman who had stood in a similar garden once, in similar light, watching the same man be quietly and genuinely careful with something small and hurt, who had felt the same thing Vera was currently feeling, who had believed, with the same quality of belief that came from watching something real rather than constructed, that the thing she was feeling was accurate information about who this man was. Vera held her gaze for one moment, long enough to receive the recognition fully, not long enough to make it a conversation. Then she walked past. She walked back to her quarters with the deliberate step of a woman carrying something that required steadiness to transport without spilling. She had spent 2 years building careful documentation. She had spent 5 days at this gathering maintaining a composure that had grown steadily more costly to maintain with each day's accumulation of evidence against it. She had listened to Dara's account with full attention and filed every detail with the accuracy she brought to everything she documented. She had done everything correctly, and she was still here, still carrying the feeling she had not authorized, still aware of the structural change that the garden had opened in the architecture she had built with such deliberate, expensive care. The change was not visible from the outside. It was the internal kind, the kind that began small and spread quietly, and was, in the experience of people who understood these things, often more significant than the kind that announced itself. She heard his footsteps behind her, unhurried, certain,
coming to find her again. She did not stop walking, but she noticed she did not walk faster either.
She had made the most costly mistake available to a woman with her knowledge and her history of evidence-based self-protection. Not an uninformed mistake. She had done the reading, paid the attention, listened carefully to the women who had been where she was standing, and had come back from it changed in ways that did not fully reverse. She had done all of those things thoroughly and accurately, and she was still here, still carrying the feeling, still aware that somewhere between a pup's chin on her knee and a king's unguarded face in the gold morning light, she had started believing something she had specifically, deliberately, at great personal cost, decided not to believe. She had started to believe he might be different. And the most significant thing about it, the thing she walked back to her quarters carrying alongside everything else, was that she had not started believing it because she had stopped paying attention. She had started believing it because she had been paying the most careful attention of her life. And this was what that attention had given her. She heard about it from Marin. Not from him, not from the council members who had apparently gone very quiet very fast. From Marin, who found her in the library the following morning and delivered the account with the careful, level precision of a woman reporting observed conditions, factual, sequential, entirely without editorial comment, which was itself a form of editorial comment from a woman who was precise about everything, and therefore precise about what she chose to omit. A senior council member, Heydrich, 22 years in service, confident in the particular way of men who had never once been required to reconsider their own standing because their standing had never been seriously challenged. He had spoken about Vera in a council session the previous afternoon, the border pack female, he had called her, which was technically accurate and deliberately reductive in the way that technically accurate language was often used, a distraction, a problem with a straightforward solution if the king could be persuaded to think with his judgment rather than with something less reliable. He had not finished the sentence, because Calum had gone still. Marin paused here in her account. She appeared to be selecting her next words with unusual care, the specific care of a woman describing something she had witnessed and not yet fully integrated into her existing framework for understanding the person she had spent 20 years observing. Not the stillness before a decision being executed, she said. Something different, something without a name in the catalog she had spent 20 years building. He had looked at Heydrich for a long moment with the specific quality of attention that had nothing of strategy in it and everything of genuine personal offense, the kind that did not arrive through calculation but through something being activated that the person had not previously known they possessed. Then he had spoken, quietly, precisely, without raising his voice or invoking the full weight of his position. He had simply made clear, with the cold and complete precision of a man who had just encountered a line he had not known existed until someone crossed it, that what had just happened would not happen again.
The chamber had gone completely quiet. Heydrich had sat down. Marin finished her account. She looked at Vera for a moment with eyes that offered nothing and asked for nothing, and were simply, accurately present. Then she left. Vera sat with the information for a long time. This was the specific and escalating problem that Dara's warning and 2 years of careful documentation had not adequately prepared her for, because the pattern she had documented, the pattern she had built her preparation around, was indifference, the damage of a man who never looked back. She did not have a category for a man who looked,
who noticed, who had just stood in a room she was not present in and defended her to people she had no standing with, not because it was strategically useful, not because she would ever know about it through any channel he controlled, but because something in him had shifted enough that the alternative had become genuinely, personally unacceptable to him. That was not the pattern she had documented. That was something else entirely. She did not let herself name what it was. She was not ready to survive naming it accurately, but she could no longer call it nothing, because nothing had left the situation entirely and had not indicated any intention of returning. The something that had replaced it was specific and present and growing more difficult to manage with each piece of evidence she collected. And the evidence was accumulating at a rate she had not planned for. She thought about Dara's account in the corridor, the quality of the attention at the beginning, how complete it felt, how it carried none of the performed quality of men who were aware of pursuing. She thought about Dara's face in the garden corridor that morning, carrying the recognition of a woman who had felt the same thing, and believed the same thing, and had been accurate in her belief right up until the moment she was not. She thought about the specific structural difference between a man who had always been exactly what he appeared to be, and a man who was becoming something he had not previously been. She was not certain which of those she was observing.
He found her that evening on the eastern balcony, where the light went amber before it went dark, and the sounds of the celebration drifted up from below in a way that made them feel both present and distant simultaneously. He stood beside her without preamble and told her he had declined the council's arranged meeting with the political candidate. Quietly, simply, without making it a declaration or a gesture or anything that requested a specific response from her. Not for you, he said, for himself. Because he had decided he was finished making choices that belonged to the man his father had been. She looked at him for a long time in the amber light. She looked at the jaws she had studied from a distance for 2 years, and the gold eyes watching her with something in them she was consistently running out of accurate names for, and the hands that had fed a frightened animal in a cold garden with no audience and no intention of being credited for it. She felt the crack in her architecture widen with the specific, helpless precision of a woman watching something she constructed with great care begin to change in ways she had not designed it for. She did not call it love. She was not ready to survive that level of accuracy about what she was feeling, but she could not call it nothing anymore, and the nothing being gone was its own kind of statement about where she actually was in relation to this situation. She looked at him for a long moment more. Then she told him what she needed. One thing. She needed him to stand before his full council and choose her openly, at genuine cost, with no safety net, no strategic management of optics, no arrangement of the situation to reduce the risk before taking it. Just the choice itself, standing in the open with nothing holding it up except the fact that it was the choice he was making. 3 days, she said. He looked at her with those eyes that had stopped performing indifference some time ago and were doing something now that she did not have a fully accurate name for. Then he nodded once and left. Vera stood on the balcony in the last of the amber light and pressed her hands against the stone railing and understood with complete clarity
that she was no longer certain which outcome frightened her more.
He was steady for 60 seconds. That was the part that would stay with her longest. Not the ending, but the beginning. The way he stood before the full council on the third morning, with his wolf settled for the first time in 7 months, and declined the political match with a clarity and directness that required no softening because it was not a negotiation. It was a decision, arrived at and stated. The voice of a man who had looked at the choice in front of him and made it without the elaborate preparation that characterized choices made from uncertainty. Vera stood at the chamber's edge and felt something happen in her chest that she did not have a prepared response to. She believed him. For 60 seconds, she believed him with the specific, complete quality of belief that arrived not from wanting something to be true, but from watching evidence accumulate past the point where alternative explanations remained credible. She believed him the way you believed something you had tested carefully and found consistently accurate. For 60 seconds, that was the most frightening thing that had happened in this story. Then Hadrick stood. Not alone, 3 others rose with him in a coordinated movement, prearranged, the specific choreography of people who had been planning this particular moment longer than anyone else in the room had realized was being planned. A formal leadership challenge. Not a political disagreement, not a council objection to a specific decision, a structural challenge, the kind that invoked pack law at its foundational level, the kind that, if it gained 2 more signatures before the prescribed window closed, placed the actual governing authority of the Obsidian Throne in formal procedural dispute for the first time in 11 years. The chamber temperature dropped with a speed that was almost physical. Every advisor went still with the calculating stillness of people rapidly and privately revising their assessment of which side of an emerging line they wanted to be standing on when the line finished forming. The political geography of the room rearranged itself in real time. Vera watched it happen. She watched Calum watch it happen, and she watched his face as the full weight of what was occurring registered. She saw the exact moment fear arrived. Not weakness. She was precise about that distinction because the distinction mattered. Fear. The specific, legitimate fear of a man who had spent 11 years building something significant and was watching someone place their hands around its structural foundation and apply pressure. His wolf surged. She could see it in the sudden change in the quality of his stillness, the fractional shift in his jaw, the way his eyes moved from the settled gold of a decision already made to something older and more reflexive, something that predated the council chamber and the 11 years of rain and the garden in the early morning and all of it. She thought, with the focused urgency of someone watching a situation approach a critical point, hold. She thought, you were doing it. You were exactly there. Hold. She watched him find her face across the chamber. She watched him hold her gaze for 1 moment, and she watched the choice split. She saw it happen in real time, the bifurcation of the moment into 2 possible versions of the man standing in front of her. The version that had been building since the first morning in the garden, the one that had sat on cold ground without agenda and been uncertain in a way that had no performance in it. And the version that had existed for 34 years before the garden, the one that had been built by a father who called indifference power and had never once required the examination of its costs. She watched him reach for the second one, not with anger, not with cruelty, with the reflexive efficiency of a man reaching for the tool that had never failed him when he needed something to not fail him. "I will use the authority of this throne," he said, and his voice was steady, which was somehow the worst part of it, "to ensure she remains, by her choice,
The pause was less than a full breath, or otherwise. The chamber went silent. Across the room, Dara Voss closed her eyes. She did not look surprised. She looked like a woman who had been standing outside a room, listening to a conversation she already knew the shape of, waiting only for the specific words she had known were coming so she could stop waiting for them. Her face held no satisfaction, no sense of having been proven right in a way that brought any relief. Just the exhausted, specific weight of confirmed knowledge, the particular heaviness of something you had known and had hoped, despite knowing it, that you would turn out to have been wrong about. Vera looked at Calum for a long time. Her face was completely still, not with the composed warmth she had been maintaining for the past 5 days, not with the pleasant unreachability she had practiced for years before this gathering. Something passed all of that. Something that had moved through composure and arrived somewhere on the other side that had no performance remaining in it at all. She looked at him the way you looked at something you had been trying to save, that had just shown you, clearly and specifically, that it could not be saved yet. Not with anger. Anger would have required surprise, and she was not surprised. She was something significantly heavier than surprised. She was the specific kind of devastated that arrived when your worst, most carefully documented knowledge was confirmed, not by a stranger, not by the man she had studied from a safe distance for 2 years, but by the man who had sat on cold ground in a gold morning and been real in a way that had cracked something in her that she had spent a very long time building. That man had just reached for control the moment that control was cheaper than the alternative. She nodded once, slowly, not in agreement with what had been said, in recognition of what it meant. The small, deliberate nod of a woman filing a final piece of information away permanently, the piece she had not wanted to have, that completed a picture she had been hoping would turn out to be incomplete. She finally knew with complete certainty who he was when he was afraid. And she knew, with the clarity that everything in her life had been building toward, that afraid was not a moment. It was a nature. She turned toward the chamber door. She did not look back. She heard it before she had fully crossed the threshold, his voice behind her in the silence she was leaving, saying her name, not with authority, not with the weight of the Obsidian Throne behind it, not with any of the mechanisms that had always been available to him and that he had, until 30 seconds ago, declined to use. Just her name, in his voice, stripped of everything except the one thing that arrived after the right choice had passed and the wrong one had already been made, and the difference between those two things was becoming in real time completely clear. She did not stop walking. She heard him say it again. She did not stop walking. She walked out of the chamber with the steady, deliberate step of a woman who had made a decision that her entire life had been preparing her to make. And she did not let herself feel the full weight of what the decision cost until she was far enough away that no one who mattered could see her carry it. She pulled over once on the road home, not to reconsider. The consideration was complete. She pulled over because something in her needed one moment, just one, just this, to sit with the full weight of what she was carrying before she continued moving forward with it. The loss, the love that remained entirely present and showed no indication of reducing itself to a more manageable size on any timeline that was convenient for her. The specific exhaustion of having been right about a man she had wanted with everything she had available to her to be wrong about. The particular loneliness of wisdom that it protected you and cost you in the same action and never once apologized for either. She sat in the dark with the engine ticking and let it be exactly as large as it was. She did not make it smaller. She did not make it more bearable. She did not make it into something more useful to the story she would eventually tell herself about survival. She let it be what it was. Then she rolled down the window. Cold air, the dark road ahead going somewhere she had chosen, toward a border pack and a quiet life that had always been hers, that no one had given her and nothing could take, regardless of what else was taken. She breathed. She put the car in drive. She was not recovered. She was not healed in any way that the word healing implied completion. She was broken in the specific way that things broke when they were in the process of becoming stronger at the broken places, which was not a comfort available to her in this moment, but was, she understood, with the distant accuracy of someone who had survived previous versions of Alone, a true thing about what was coming for her, even if she could not access it yet. She was broken. She was driving. She was still here. And the part of her that had survived every previous version of Alone recognized, quietly and without any requirement for witnesses, that still here was the beginning. Dara found him still standing in the empty chamber. She did not sit. She stood across the room from him with the steadiness of a woman who had made a decision before entering and was not going to revise it once inside. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not bitterness and not satisfaction and not any of the things he might have expected from someone who had been carrying what she had been carrying for as long as she had been carrying it. It was the expression of a woman setting something down, not because she was finished with it, but because she had found the right place for it and the right moment to put it there. She told him what Vera was. Not in the language of sentiment, in the language of specifics, the only language that would reach him, she had decided, because it was the only language that had ever reached him when anything had reached him at all. She told him what it meant that a woman who knew everything about him had chosen, with open eyes and full information, to believe in him anyway.
That, Dara said, is the rarest thing one person can offer another. Not love. Love arrived with less information and more hope, and that was its own valuable thing. What Vera had offered was rarer than love. It was belief in the presence of complete knowledge, belief that had looked at the full documented record and chosen, despite everything the record contained, to see the thing that was not yet in the record but was becoming. You will spend a long time, she said, learning the weight of having held something like that and let it go. Not as a prediction of suffering, as a statement of what was now available to him for the first time. The actual weight of what things cost, which was the beginning of the only kind of understanding that could eventually make him worth what someone like Vera had briefly, at great personal cost, believed he was becoming. Then she left, without waiting for a response, without needing one. She had delivered the thing. What he did with it was no longer her responsibility. Calum stood in the empty chamber after she had gone. The room was empty in the specific way that rooms became empty when the person who had given them their particular quality of presence had left. Not just quieter, but structurally different, as if something that had been performing a load-bearing function had been removed, and the space was still in the process of understanding what that meant for everything around it. He did not reach for any of the mechanisms that had always been available to him in difficult moments, the authority, the strategy, the performance of a king who had complete command of the situation, because complete command of situations was what kings had. He simply stood, with what was in the room. He did not look away from it. That was new. That was, perhaps, the only new thing about him that this entire situation had produced, the capacity to stand in a room with what was in it and not look away. It was not enough. He understood that with complete clarity. It was not enough. But it was the beginning of the only thing that could eventually become enough.
He stood with the full understanding of what he had held, specific, particular, completely unrepeatable, and what it would have required of him to keep it, and what it meant, precisely and without softening, that he had not arrived at that requirement in time. He stood with the understanding that becoming was not the same as having become, that the man he had been in the garden was real. That version of him was not performance and not Stranti, and he had not invented it. But real and complete were not the same thing, and incomplete things, when placed under the specific pressure that the council chamber had placed him under, revealed their incompleteness in ways that cost the people nearest to them. He did not know what came after this. He did not know if a version of him capable of being what had been required was something that existed or could be built. He did not know if it mattered now that she was gone. But he was, for the first time in his life, asking the right questions, and that was where every real thing began.
The moon rose over the Ironblood territory, cold and clear, and the same moon it had always been, entirely indifferent to the specific weight of what was happening beneath it. Somewhere on the road toward the border, a woman who had loved a king was moving through the dark with the window of her carriage down, and the cold air coming in and the trees on both sides of the road standing in the particular stillness of things that had been present for a very long time, and had learned that most of what passed beneath them resolved itself eventually into something quieter than it began. He stood in an empty chamber with the first honest accounting of himself he had ever been required to conduct. Two people, each alone, each carrying something they had not been carrying before this gathering, something with no clean resolution and no comfortable destination, and that would require a long time to understand fully. The moon was the same moon over both of them. The road was the road she had chosen. The chamber was the room where he was learning what rooms felt like when you had to occupy them honestly. She heard the wolf before she saw it. A messenger wolf, one of the Obsidian Throne's trained runners, gray and steady and moving through the dark at a pace that said it had been given this errand with urgency and had been taking the urgency seriously since the moment it left the keep. It reached her carriage and stopped, sat, and set down at her feet with the careful precision of an animal that understood the value of what it was carrying, a letter sealed with black wax bearing the crest of the Obsidian Throne. Not a formal document, the seal was unadorned, no council markings, no official insignia beyond the crest itself, just him, writing to her the way a man wrote when he had nothing left to use except the truth, and had decided, perhaps too late, that the truth was the only thing worth sending. She looked at it for a long time in the moonlight. She looked at the road ahead, dark, chosen, going somewhere that had always been hers. She looked back at the letter. She had spent 2 years knowing exactly who he was. She had spent 5 days watching him become someone she had not documented. She had spent 1 moment in a chamber watching him choose the version of himself she had always been afraid of. She knew what all of that meant. She looked at the letter. She looked at the road. And for the first time since she had built her walls and counted her seconds and decided she already knew how every version of this story ended, she was not certain that she did.